Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1. Something lived in the garbage. 3 weeks. That's how long whatever was inside that house had been left to fester before Wade's phone finally rang. Longer than usual. Long enough for officials to argue in circles, to weigh paperwork against conscience, to consider the easier option of pushing the whole structure into the earth and pretending it never existed. But the place had history stamped into it. Old records, old money, old rules. And that meant someone somewhere had protested loudly enough to stop the bulldozers. So instead, they called Wade. He'd been doing this kind of work for more than 2 decades, ever since steady jobs dried up and pride became a luxury. Cleaning out what others abandoned, walking into spaces people couldn't stomach. He didn't need explanations about filth or excess. He'd seen houses crushed under their own weight, rooms sealed by stacks of paper, walls breathing with the remains of animals no one bothered to count until it was too late. None of that was new. What was new was the way the county man spoke to him. Careful, slow, each word chosen like it might explode if handled wrong. That tone settled deep in Wade's chest, heavy and wrong, and stayed there even after the call ended. The house waited at the end of a road most people didn't know existed. Pavement gave way to dirt to twin scars cut through scrubland, and then nothing but silence. No neighbors close enough to matter. The nearest one was miles back and famous for hearing nothing and hatting everyone. The family who owned the place had been there for generations, each more withdrawn than the last, until finally the law stepped in and forced them out, or tried to. No one had laid eyes on the siblings who lived there for years. Not at the store, not at church, not even in passing. They existed only as rumors and paperwork until they didn't exist at all. Wade parked at the edge of the property and let the engine run. He studied the house the way you study a stranger who's staring back too hard. It was once grand, you could tell. Ornate lines buried beneath years of clumsy expansions, pieces bolted on wherever space ran out. The porch had been sealed shut with mismatched boards and metal sheets. Upstairs windows were darkened from the inside, covered with sagging plastic that clung like skin. The whole thing lean, tired and unbalanced, sinking into the ground as if it had finally decided to lie down. When he opened the truck door, the air hit him hard, sharp enough to sting his eyes. A biting chemical burn layered over something sweeter, heavier, decay warmed by time. It wrapped around him instantly, soaked into his clothes, and for the first time in years, Wade hesitated. Whatever had been living in that house hadn't just been waiting. It had been settling in. Something else rode beneath it, something that flipped a switch deep in his spine, older than logic. He walked into rot before, into places where filth announced itself loud and proud. This was quieter, stratified, the kind of stench that felt bottomless, like staring into murky water and knowing there were shapes moving far below the surface. He checked his gear by habit, the ritual steadying him. Mask sealed tight, gloves pulled high, light strapped to his head, the blade heavy at his side, not for defense, just to carve pathways through walls that shouldn't exist. The county had handed him a diagram from the late 19th century, neat lines and labeled rooms, but Wade already knew better. Houses like this rewrote themselves over time. Hallways vanished, rooms collapsed inward, the past became fiction. The front door resisted him, opening only a few inches before slamming into something immovable. He shone his light through the crack and felt his stomach tighten. A solid barrier of refuse rose on the other side, crushed together from floor to ceiling, paper fused to plastic, cardboard flattened into strata, the whole thing pressed into a single mass like stone. The windows were no better, each one sealed shut from the inside. He circled the structure slowly, boots crunching in weeds, until he found it, a basement window on the shaded side, uncovered and shattered long ago. A leftover from a time when curiosity still brought kids this far out. He lowered himself through the opening, heart thudding harder than it should. His feet landed on something soft, yielding. For half a second, his mind betrayed him with images he didn't want. Then the light showed the truth. Trash bags, piled high, swollen and slick, stacked like a nest of dark growths filling the space below. He dropped fully inside and nearly retched. Even through the mask, the air clawed at him. It wasn't just thick, it felt alive, clinging to his skin, burning his sinuses, forcing tears he couldn't stop. He stood there, ankle deep in refuse, trying to get his bearings. There were no walls, no clear ceiling, just garbage packed so tightly it formed its own architecture, enclosing him in a hollowed-out chamber. And ahead, barely visible in the reach of his light, a passage cut through the mass. Narrow, low, a tunnel no wider than his shoulders. He knew what it meant. He'd been here before, in other houses, other nightmares, but knowing didn't make it easier. As he knelt and leaned forward, the corridor seemed to breathe around him, the packed debris shifting softly, whispering as if it resented being disturbed. The walls shifted as he inched forward, settling with a tired, whispering sound. This place had history you could read with your hands. The tunnel wasn't random, it was layered. Older lives stacked on top of newer ones. Bright ink headlines gave way to duller pages, then a paper so faded it barely remembered what it once said. Objects were fused into the passage like fossils. Cracked containers, misshapen bottles, fabric stiff with age. Fragments of furniture reduced to shapes without purpose. He followed the passage as it bent away, moving slow, careful. Then his palm pressed into something slick. He didn't look. He didn't slow. He pulled his hand free and kept crawling, forcing his breathing to stay even. Every so often, the tunnel split, offering choices that all felt wrong. At each turn, he left a mark. Bold paint slashed against the dull gray walls, signs pointing back toward the way out. Losing direction down here wasn't a mistake you walked away from. The ground beneath him began to rise. Gradually at first, then unmistakably. He was climbing. The air changed to older, drier, heavy with dust that clung to his throat. The debris here belonged to another decade. Brittle pages, sun-bleached plastic, a small toy crushed nearly flat, its color long gone. Then his fingers touched something that didn't belong. He stopped instantly. The texture was wrong, solid, angular. He angled his light and felt his chest tighten. A short plank lay embedded in the floor of the tunnel, nails driven through it from below, their points jutting upward like waiting mouths. It wasn't hidden. It was positioned, tilted just enough that a crawling body would press straight down onto it. He leaned back, pulse hammering, and studied the space around it. The surrounding debris was worn smooth in places, shifted, touched. This trap hadn't been forgotten. Someone had tended it. A chill spread through him that had nothing to do with the air. He thought of the pause before the phone call, the careful phrasing, the delay that suddenly felt intentional. He marked the plank and continued, slower now. Before every movement, he tested the ground ahead with the blade, tapping, probing, refusing to trust anything unseen. Not far past the first, he found another, then another, each one placed where pain would be worst, each one waiting. The passage finally widened, spilling him into a larger space. He recognized it only by instinct, a sink buried in refuse, its metal curve barely visible. What had once been a kitchen now felt more like a collapsed cave. The ceiling hovered low enough to bow his neck. Trash rose almost to meet it, pressing inward from all sides. His light skimmed over the compressed walls, finding no edges, no corners, just more mass, more weight. And in that cramped, suffocating room, the realization settled in quietly, heavier than the air itself. This house wasn't just filled. It had been arranged. The debris pressed in tighter here, stacked high enough to feel deliberate. He nearly stepped into death without realizing it. His boots snagged on something thin, something that pulled back. He froze, balance teetering, heart slamming hard enough to shake his ribs. Slowly, carefully, he looked down. A filament stretched across the passage at ankle height, so fine it vanished unless the light struck it just right. He followed its path with his eyes. It disappeared into the wall. Lowering himself inch by inch, he traced the line with his beam until the trash gave way to a hollowed pocket. Inside it sat a single shell, cradled in a crude clamp of wood and twisted wire. The line fed into a nail holding back a spring under tension. He understood immediately. One more step, one careless tug, and the mechanism would have snapped forward. At this range, it wouldn't have killed him cleanly. It would have torn him apart where he stood. He marked the wire in bright paint, lifted his foot over it, and straightened slowly. Standing there in that low-ceiling chamber, he tried to make sense of the intent behind it all. The traps fit a certain story, a family at war with the world, years of conflict with officials, neighbors, anyone who tried to cross their boundary, people who stopped trusting anything beyond their own walls and decided to defend themselves by force. He'd heard of setups like this before, rumors passed between cleanup crews. But the explanation didn't sit right. The dangers weren't near entrances. They weren't guarding exits. They were buried deep, placed where no outsider would ever wander by accident. These weren't warnings. They were barriers. He searched the room carefully and found more, 3 additional lines, each rigged to fire across the space at different heights. Someone had planned for crawling bodies, standing bodies, stumbling bodies. Someone had expected persistence. Someone had expected pursuit. Beyond the kitchen, another passage opened, slanting upward into darkness. He checked his watch. Nearly an hour had slipped away. A sensible man would have turned back then, called it in, told the county this wasn't a cleanup job. It was something else entirely. Something that required people with badges, specialists, teams that didn't count their worth by the hour. But he didn't leave. He never did. Because beneath the grime and danger, beneath the rot that chased most people away, there was always a question that wouldn't let go. A need to know how things ended up this way. What choices had been made. What had been hidden. The passage rose again, drawing him forward deeper into the house. The passage climbed again, carrying him higher into the house. Up here, the chaos changed character. The trash wasn't simply dumped, it was arranged. Newspapers had been bundled tight and stacked with care, fitted together like crude masonry. This wasn't neglect, it was construction. The tunnel itself felt sturdier, shored up with boards lashed together by wire, reinforced to hold its shape. Someone had learned how this place moved, how it sagged and shifted, and had taught it to stay still. The defenses grew more deliberate too. A concrete block hung overhead, balanced in silence, ready to fall if disturbed. Another shell sat braced at chest height, aimed straight down the crawl space. Metal teeth waited open in the shadows, position where a knee would naturally land. He marked each one, photographed each threat, knowing the images would fail to capture what mattered: the suffocating closeness, the way every breath tasted wrong, the knowledge that one careless motion would end everything. You couldn't understand this place from pictures. You had to be inside it. The tunnel ended abruptly at something that didn't belong. A real wall. And set into it, untouched by trash, was a door. Not makeshift, not salvage, solid steel, mounted cleanly into a reinforced frame bolted straight into the bones of the house. The garbage maze had guided him to it with intention, funneling him through fear and filth to this single point. He straightened as much as the ceiling allowed, standing in a pocket of space carved carefully out of the debris. His light flickered across the metal, casting long shadows that made the surrounding walls seem to swell and contract. The air here was different. Still foul, still thick, but layered beneath it was a sharp, acrid sting that scraped his throat and made his eyes burn. The door had once been painted white. Time had turned it sickly yellow, the surface flacking away. Near the bottom, deep scratches scarred the steel, long, desperate, as if something had tried to claw its way through. His hand hovered over the handle. Every warning he'd ever learned screamed at him to leave, to follow the painted arrows back the way he'd come, to step outside, breathe clean air, and let someone else deal with whatever waited here. But he was already committed. This was his job. This was what he did: walk into places others refused to see through to the end. If he turned away now, the questions would follow him forever. He gripped the handle and pulled. The door resisted at first, then began to move. The door swung open almost silently, sliding on hinges that had clearly been oiled for decades. The air that rushed out hit Wade like a physical force, even through the respirator. It wasn't the familiar stench of decay. Not exactly. This was something else, something concentrated, human. Months, maybe years of living packed into a sealed chamber. Sweat, fear, waste. And the quiet weight of isolation pressed into every corner. His headlamp cut through the darkness and revealed a room that shouldn't exist here. Pale blue walls glowed faintly in the beam. The floor was white tile, spotless as if someone had polished it yesterday. A twin bed with a metal frame stood in one corner, sheets once white now dulled to gray. A plastic bucket rested nearby. A folding table held stacks of children's books, their covers worn soft from touch, pages smoothed from countless readings. Across from the door, a shelf lined with stuffed animals caught the light in their button eyes, dozens of tiny reflections staring back. It was a child's room, or a nursery, though not for a baby. The space was cared for, immaculate in a way that made the surrounding filth of the house feel obscene. Someone had maintained this room. Someone had lived here, or kept another alive within it. Wade stepped across the threshold, boots clattering against tile that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. The room measured maybe 10 by 12 feet, ceiling low enough that he could brush it with his hand. No windows, no doors except the steel one he'd entered through. The air was stale but clean. A small vent in the ceiling, covered by mesh, hinted at some circulation, some connection to the outside world. He moved to the bed. The sheets bore stains that made his stomach twist. The pillow held a depression from long use. The books on the table were classics, read over and over, the pages soft as cloth, covers patched with tape. And there, face down on the table, lay a photograph in a plastic frame. Wade picked it up, turning it carefully. The image had faded to ghostly colors, but he could still see it. A family standing proudly in front of this house back when it was whole. A man and woman, middle-aged, flanking a boy no more than 4, grinning at the camera. Behind them, 2 teenagers, Dale and Darlene Mallister, recognizable even in youth. The boy wore a striped shirt, clutching a small stuffed bear in a vest. He glanced at the shelf of stuffed animals. The bear was there, the same one watching him with button eyes, 30 years older, 30 years of waiting. Wade set the photograph down carefully, face up, and stepped back, hands trembling. The room was silent, but in that silence it spoke volumes. Hope and despair frozen together, preserved in this impossibly clean corner amid a house consumed by filth and danger. The shelf of stuffed animals stared at him like sentinels. A bear in a faded vest, a rabbit with one floppy ear, a dog whose button eyes seemed to follow him with unnerving attention. There were dozens, some patched, some missing limbs, their repairs glaring through worn fur. They were old, decades old, witnesses to whatever had unfolded in this room. A bucket in the corner caught his attention, its contents giving off a sharp, acrid smell that mingled with something cleaner, chemical. Bleach. Someone had been scrubbing, trying to hold onto some semblance of hygiene, trying to keep the space sterile. Wade turned slowly, taking in every detail, trying to make sense of the contradiction. This wasn't just a room. This was a cell, a carefully maintained space carved out of a mountain of filth. Decades of trash stacked around it, traps set to protect it, yet inside, a fragment of order persisted. Someone had lived here, or worse, they had been kept here. His mind flicked to the Mallisters, Dale and Darlene. Siblings, isolated, stubborn, unyielding. 30 years in this house, decades of silence, battles with neighbors, restraining orders, eviction notices ignored. He thought of how isolation warps a soul, how cruelty and neglect can twist a person beyond recognition. Then the sound hit him, a shallow, ragged breathing. It wasn't the mechanical sound of the house settling, it was living. Someone breathing somewhere beneath the room. Wade's headlamp swept across the pristine blue walls, the bed, the shelf, but saw nothing. The sound came again, lower, under the bed. He dropped to his knees, pulse thrumming violently, teeth clenching with fear. And there, staring back at him, was a boy, or something close to one, thin to the point of fragility, bones visible under skin like a skeletal diagram. His long, matted hair fell over his eyes, and he didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge Wade as human, as intruder, as rescuer. Only his teeth betrayed a story, sharp, filed, or ground down to unnatural points. Circular scars dotted arms and legs, burns perhaps, a history written on flesh. His nails were long, cracked, dirt and something darker caked beneath them. And scattered across the shadows under the bed, tiny bones glinted in the beam of the headlamp. Rat bones, cat bones, remnants of creatures that had crawled in through the vent, mingling with the story of the boy's long captivity. Wade swallowed hard, every instinct screaming. This was no longer just a house. This was a prison, a mausoleum of innocence stolen, and he had just walked straight into its heart. Wade froze, his mind blank, unable to form words. The boy beneath the bed was real, breathing, moving, but he was no longer simply human. His skin was pale as dried parchment, limbs grotesquely long, joints bending in ways that seemed wrong. His eyes stayed locked, unblinking, untrusting, staring like they had never learned the language of humans. A low sound rolled from his throat, not a word, not a cry, but something ancient and raw. Wade forced a sound through his respirator, a voice meant to soothe, to connect, but it vanished into the air, meaningless to a creature that had long forgotten the meaning of words. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, hand extended in a gesture he hoped was safe, non-threatening. The boy tracked it with those fixed eyes, waiting, measuring. Then in a heartbeat, he struck. Faster than Wade could process, the boy shot from beneath the bed like a coiled spring released. His mouth opened wider than it should have, teeth jagged and sharpened into points that glinted in the light. Wade barely had time to register their shape before impact drove him backward. His head slammed against the wall, the headlamp swinging wild, casting monstrous shadows that danced across the room. The boy was on him, impossibly light yet fierce with desperation, clawing, not hands exactly, but instruments of survival, at the collar of his shirt. The strength wasn't unnatural. It was the raw, unrefined power of someone who had learned to survive on scraps, on rats, on sheer will. Adrenaline sharpened every motion. Wade grabbed for the boy's wrists, but it was like trying to grip smoke. The sound came again, a deep, guttural vibration. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, rattling through the room and into Wade's chest. The boy's face was inches from his own. He could smell it now, iron, rot, and something foul beneath it all. Then came the bite. The respirator mask tore under his teeth. Rubber split, hissing as the seal broke. In a sudden jerk, the boy ripped his head back, wrenching the mask free entirely. Wade gasped, air escaping in a ragged rush, eyes wide, heart hammering. The fight for control had begun, and for the first time, Wade understood. This was not a boy in the way the world defined one. This was a predator, molded by neglect and darkness, fighting for every second of life he had ever known. Wade sucked in a ragged breath, lungs searing as he drew in the room's poisoned air. Decades of human waste, bleach, and something faintly sweet, rotten beneath it all. He heaved the boy off him and scrambled backward, coughing and gagging. The boy dropped to all fours, crouching like a wild animal, head low. Eyes locked on Wade through the flickering light of the fallen headlamp. He looked less human than ever. His spine twisted unnaturally, joints bent at impossible angles that made Wade's own bones ache in sympathy. Panic slammed into him as his back hit the cold steel door. His hand closed around the handle just as the boy made that low, vibrating sound again, muscles coiling like a spring. Then, launch. Wade flung himself through the doorway and slammed it behind him. The impact rattled the frame half a heartbeat later as the boy's body struck the steel. Scratching followed, fast, frantic metal clattering beneath claws. Wade pressed himself against the door, teeth chattering, trembling from adrenaline and fear. The tunnel air, foul as it was, felt clean compared to what he'd just inhaled. On the other side of the steel, he could hear the boy moving, hearing that awful vibration, a sound almost human but twisted by isolation. He lived in that room, a child-shaped prison in the center of decades of filth. The Malisters had kept him there, fed him, perhaps, given him books and stuffed animals, tried to preserve some fragment of childhood even as it became grotesque. But they had made a mistake. Meat, or maybe survival itself, had warped him. Perhaps he had been a normal child once, years ago. The darkness, the solitude, the constant suffocation of garbage had remade him, made him a creature who could endure what would kill anyone else. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed in. Wade's chest heaved, every breath sharp, every muscle tight. Then a sound, soft, hesitant, broken. Not words, not really, but a shape of words, echoes of speech long forgotten. A sound that could have been please, could have been peace, could have been nothing at all. Just the fragile attempt of a voice that remembered how to exist. Wade shut his eyes tightly. He thought of the boy's unblinking stare, eyes more hungry than angry, more desperate than malicious. Thought of how long he must have been trapped in that room, of who he had been before the Malisters sealed him away. A grandchild, a neighbor's child, a boy stolen by neglect. Thought of the teeth filed or worn sharp. Thought of the circular burns on his arms. thought of the life stolen, reshaped, and preserved in isolation. And somewhere beneath it all, Wade realized this boy had survived not because he was strong, but because no one else had ever truly seen him. He couldn't stop thinking about what the boy must have eaten to stay alive. The scratching resumed, lighter now, almost careful. Not an attack, a test. Fingers or claws tracing the steel, searching for give. Wade forced himself away from the door and began crawling back through the tunnel, moving on instinct alone. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped his phone. When the emergency operator answered, his mouth refused to cooperate. He tried once, failed, tried again. Finally, the words came out fractured and raw. "There's a boy, this address. Send police, medics, anyone. Don't come alone. Bring weapons." He gave her only what she needed, nothing else. No explanations he couldn't finish. Then he followed the trail he painted for himself, crawling backward through his own errors, past wires and boards and hanging weights, retracing the slow, suffocating history of trash and obsession. The tunnel spat him out through the basement opening, and he collapsed onto the sand outside, ripping off his gloves and retching until his body was empty. The sun was going down. 4 hours had passed, though it felt like he'd aged years inside that house. The sky burned purple and orange above the scrub, and somewhere far off, an owl called as night settled in. The stench followed him out, clung to his clothes, his hair, his lungs. He knew it would never really leave. He sat there staring at the house while he waited for sirens, trying to understand what had been built on that land. Not just a horde, not just madness, a fortress of waste, corridors and traps, and at its heart something impossibly clean. A bedroom, a nursery, a cage. The boy hadn't attacked out of cruelty. Wade understood that now. He'd attacked because that was all he knew how to do. Years of darkness had stripped away language, trust, identity. What remained was survival. The Malisters hadn't just hidden him. They had reshaped him, breaking him down until he became something that could endure a world no human should. Wade's throat burned where the boy had clawed at him. He touched the skin and felt shallow cuts, lines that came terrifyingly close. Another second and those teeth would have found his throat, would have opened him the same way the boy had opened animals that wandered into that room over the years. The boy hadn't known he was being rescued. To him, Wade was just flesh entering the cage. And as the first distant sirens began to rise, Wade realized the most horrifying truth of all wasn't what lived inside that house. It was what that house had taught a child to become. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the stillness. Red and blue flashes bled between the trees, washing over the palm meadows like warning fires. Wade pushed himself to his feet and walked toward the road, putting distance between himself and the house. But he knew this wasn't over, not for him. The county would call again. They always did. Someone would still have to go back inside, to record what was there, to map it, to figure out how to dismantle a structure designed to kill anyone who entered it. His thoughts drifted back to the clean room, to the boy alone in the dark, to the impossible question of whether something like that could be undone, or whether survival had already cost the boy everything else. A patrol car rolled to a stop. The deputy stepped out with his hand already near his holster. Wade recognized him instantly. Bobby Carver. Small town. Too many shared histories. Wade raised his hands anyway. "There's a boy in there," Wade said, his voice empty, worn thin. "Right in the middle of the house. He's not okay." Bobby looked past him at the dark shape of the house, then back again, eyes searching for context Wade couldn't give. Wade tried anyway. "He went for my throat. You'll need sedatives, maybe restraints." Bobby didn't respond right away. More sirens echoed down the road. Night had fully settled in, and the house behind them was nothing but a void against the stars, defined only by the absence of light. "Who is he?" Bobby asked quietly. Wade shook his head. He didn't know. Didn't even know if the boy still had a name. Maybe he never mattered enough to keep one. Maybe he'd been loved once in a way twisted enough to justify locking him away and calling it protection. Or maybe he'd been feared and this was the result. Either way, it no longer mattered. The boy was real, alive, waiting at the center of a maze he couldn't comprehend, trapped in a world made of hunger, silence, and time that never moved. More vehicles arrived, paramedics, officers, officials. The commissioner showed up too, pale and tight-faced, looking like a man who already regretted every decision that led him here. Wade told the story again and again. He tried to prepare them to give shape to what waited inside. They nodded, listened, but Wade could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him. Not yet. They would soon, when they crawled through the tunnels with weapons drawn, when they found the wires and boards and hidden mechanisms, when they reached the steel door at the heart of the house, and when they finally opened it. They would understand what happens when a place teaches a child how to stop being human. Wade stared at the house, the hulking shadow of years of madness pressed against the night sky. The tunnels, the booby traps, the endless mountains of refuse, they were all just a veil. The real horror sat at the heart of it, the boy. Once he had probably been like any other child, laughing, speaking, dreaming. And the Malisters had taken that away, piece by piece, leaving him alive but changed, leaving him human only in the most skeletal sense. The monster wasn't hiding in the dark. The monster was the dark, and it had shaped him. He slumped onto the hood of his truck, the weight of it pressing into his chest. The police moved methodically now, snapping respirators into place, testing gear, marking their lines of entry. Wade wouldn't be going back in tonight, maybe ever. He had seen enough to know that the house had already claimed its toll. Then Bobby Carver's voice cut through the night, tense, urgent. Wade turned to see the deputy pressed to his radio, his skin drained of color. The Malisters had been stopped 2 days ago in Tennessee, parked outside a Walmart. Authorities had asked about the house, about what had been left behind. And the old couple, they'd smiled, baffled, and claimed they had taken nothing. Everything that mattered, they said, had come with them. Wade felt a cold spike through his chest. He looked back at the house, the fortress of rot and plywood and twisted tunnels. The clean room at its center, the boy waiting inside. Everything that mattered they had left behind. The Malisters had abandoned him, locked him away and driven off, leaving starvation and darkness as their inheritance. The boy wasn't what they valued. He was what they discarded. And the garbage. Wade's stomach twisted as understanding sank in. It wasn't just junk. Every newspaper, every broken chair, every bag of waste had been camouflaged. A wall against guilt. A buffer against seeing the truth of what they'd done. They had layered denial upon denial until even they could pretend it didn't exist. But it did exist. It was real. And it was in that room right now, small, starving, terrified, still capable of fear, still alive. Wade counted it in his head. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the eviction. 3 weeks since the Malisters had driven away and left the boy behind. 3 weeks without food, without light, without contact. And somehow, against all odds, he was still there, waiting. The night wind rustled the palmettos. Wade exhaled slowly, shivering, and stared at the fortress, knowing that the true horror wasn't what lay in the tunnels, or the traps, or even the piles of filth. The horror was what humans could become, and what the darkness could make of someone forced to live inside it. Bobby's face drained of color, going from pale gray to ashen white in a heartbeat. The weight of the truth hit him all at once. Wade's mind flashed to the scratches along the steel door, the foul bucket in the corner, the tiny bones scattered under the bed. Survival had a price, and the boy had paid it in ways no one should ever have to. He met Bobby's eyes and saw it there, an understanding that some questions couldn't be answered. Some horrors were too deep to speak aloud. The deputy turned away, moving back toward the team, speaking in low, urgent tones that barely carried. Wade watched as they readied tranquilizer darts, radioed for more backup, prepared to reclaim the boy from the shadows he'd been forged in. They could try, they could hope, but Wade knew better. You didn't walk away untouched from a place like that. The boy would carry the room with him, the stench of bleach and rot, the memory of sharp teeth and that low, guttural vibration that was almost, but not quite, human. Wade would carry it too, long after the night ended. Inside, the officers disappeared into the fortress of trash. Their headlamps bobbed like fireflies swallowed by darkness. Wade stayed on the hood of his truck, waiting for the inevitable clash, the fight that would erupt when the boy realized someone was invading his world, waiting for the moment the rescuers would finally understand the truth. The Mallister house hadn't just been a prison. It had been an alchemy of isolation and filth, of confinement and waiting, a crucible that had reshaped its inhabitant into something beyond childhood, beyond human expectation. Whatever emerged from that room wouldn't be the boy who had gone in. It would be the creature the darkness had carved. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then it came, the scream, piercing, raw, vibrating through the palmettos, echoing across the night like a warning. Not quite words, not quite a sound anyone could name, but a force that rattled bones and sanity alike. Wade heard shouting, the urgent commands of officers, the hiss of darts fired, the chaos of predator and prey colliding in a realm no one was meant to enter. And then silence. The night pressed close, humid and heavy despite the faint Gulf breeze. Stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, witnessing nothing yet judging everything. The palmettos whispered in the wind, the owls hoot now unnervingly near. Wade's eyes never left the house. Bobby Carver emerged at last, each step slow, deliberate, as if he'd aged a decade in the span of a few minutes. His uniform was torn, streaked with blood, and his face was hollowed with the weight of what he had seen. The boy had been found, and yet nothing about the world outside would ever be the same. The Mallisters' legacy lingered in the shadows, in the tunnels, in the room at the heart of their fortress. Wade exhaled, the sound trembling in the night. The air tasted of smoke, bleach, and memory. He had survived the house, but the house and the boy it had shaped would never leave him. And somewhere inside that twisted labyrinth, the echoes of a childhood stolen and transformed, still waited, watching, waiting, breathing the darkness that had made it. The boy's struggle had ended, and for the first time, silence filled the Mallister house. Wade watched the team pause, catching their breath after the chaos. The tranquilizer darts had done their work, 3 precise hits, and the boy went still. Paramedics moved with careful precision, lifting him onto a stretcher like he was a wild animal, strapping him down with restraints designed for containment, not comfort. Even drugged, even unconscious, he radiated danger, something twisted and wrong that no one could ignore. The ambulance lights cut through the darkness, but the siren was silent, a grim courtesy to the night. Wade and Bobby lingered behind, alone amidst the echoing halls of trash and shadow. "What now?" Bobby asked, voice tight, eyes scanning the maze of filth that had hidden decades of human cruelty. Wade's gaze didn't leave the house. He saw it all, the fortress of neglect, the tunnels, the traps, the sterile room at its center. His voice came low, almost a whisper, but heavy with certainty. Burn it, every last part of it. Burn it to ash, salt the earth, plant fields over it, pretend it never existed. Bobby nodded slowly. They both knew it wouldn't be that simple. The county would demand investigation, reports, photographs that would haunt anyone who had to look at them. There would be hearings, inquiries, questions that could never be fully answered. And yet in time, someone would come to the same conclusion Wade had reached. Bulldozers would crush the walls. Backhoes would haul away mountains of garbage. Decades of hoarding, denial, and cruelty reduced to rubble. They would uncover traps, secrets, maybe even fragments of the boy's history, glimpses of who he had been before the darkness, before the isolation, before he became what he had to be to survive. But Wade didn't believe they would truly find answers. Some horrors didn't have them. Some rooms, some lives, left only questions with no resolution. He slid off the hood of his truck, the night air heavy on his shoulders, and started the engine. Bobby watched, hesitant. "You coming back tomorrow?" Wade's eyes lingered one last time on the place where the boy had lived, trapped in a meticulous prison of clean walls surrounded by miles of suffocating garbage. "No," he said. "Let someone else deal with it." The tires crunched over the dirt road, winding through palmetto fields bathed in the last light of dusk, then onto asphalt toward the distant glow of town. He didn't look back. The Mallister house, the boy, the fortress of darkness, they would remain behind, a shadowed memory etched into the night, untouchable, unforgettable. The town lights flickered ahead, but the memory of the house clung to him like smoke. Wade could still feel the boy's weight pressing down, still see those teeth, sharp, pointed, waiting. 22 years of cleanouts had taught him that nothing could shock him anymore. He'd been wrong. There was always a deeper darkness, always another layer of human cruelty lurking beneath the surface. The boy would survive in a sense. Modern medicine, therapy, and careful supervision might clean him up, feed him, try to teach him what it meant to be human again. Maybe one day he'd recall his name, remember a life before the Mallister's obsession. But Wade knew better. That boy had been reshaped by years of isolation, by relentless confinement, by a world no one else could imagine. He'd be a case study, a warning, a living reminder that monsters aren't born. They're built piece by piece, by people who should have known better. At night, in whatever sterile facility held him, the boy would dream of the clean room, its pale blue walls, the smell of bleach and filth, the silence that stretched on forever. He'd remember the tunnels, the careful crawling, the slow approach of someone who could be friend or predator, and the moment the door finally opened. The light would come, but he would have only one instinct left: survival. Wade drove through the Florida night with the windows down, trying to blow the scent of the house from his truck, but he knew it was useless. The smell, the memory, would never leave. Some things, once witnessed, remain with you. The Mallister house would eventually be demolished. The boy would be placed in the care of experts. Reports would be filed. The county would move on. But Wade would carry it all. The pristine room hidden in a fortress of trash, the boy's hollow, unblinking eyes, the dreadful sound that was almost human. He would remember that the worst monsters aren't shadows in the dark. They are the ones who build cages, feed just enough to keep life clinging and walk away, leaving humanity behind. Story 2. Snow whipped across the mountain like shards of glass, cutting through the last light of day. The chairlift shuddered violently and then froze, the shriek of metal against cable echoing across the empty slopes. Derek Novick's stomach dropped. He knew instantly. He was alone, suspended between sky and jagged earth, and something had gone horribly wrong. 6 empty chairs swayed behind him, each one a silent ghost swaying in the rising wind, and the lift station loomed faintly ahead, its outline blurring into the gathering white of the storm. He should have left. The forecast had been clear. The lift operator's warning had been blunt, even polite in its firmness. But he wanted one last run, one more descent before the mountain swallowed the day. Now the storm was moving in with sharp teeth, snow thickening so quickly it felt almost solid in the air. The chair jolted once, twice, but refused to move. Derek's gaze darted to the station half a mile above, where the emergency phone should have been, where someone, anyone, might still be finishing their rounds. But the slope below fell away 50 feet in sheer drop, jagged rocks hiding just beneath the thin blanket of snow. To his left, pines and aspen bent under the accumulating weight, groaning and creaking. To his right, the mountain dissolved into an endless white void. The wind shifted, slamming across the chair with relentless force, making the cable hum through the metal frame into his gloved hands. Derek's mind drifted, unwillingly, to Linda, his ex-wife, who'd warned him 3 years ago about his stubborn streak, his relentless drive for one more run, one more challenge, one more risk. She'd been talking about their marriage then, about his inability to accept endings. Now he realized she might as well have been talking about this very moment. He'd known the resort was shutting early. He'd watched the instructors pack up, seen the last guests descend safely into the village below, and yet he'd stayed. Pride, stubbornness, or perhaps just the quiet whisper that he could handle it, he didn't know, had kept him rooted at the top. That whisper had grown faint, nearly silenced in the last 15 minutes, replaced by the raw roar of wind and snow and the metallic groan of the lift. He checked his watch. The numbers blurred in the dim light, but time seemed irrelevant now. Suspended above a cliff, trapped between storm and steel, he felt the thin, gnawing certainty of danger settling into his bones. One mistake, one hesitation, one sudden gust, and there would be no chance to turn back. Derek's heart pounded as the chair swayed again, violently this time, as though the mountain itself were shaking him loose. Somewhere deep inside, the echo of Linda's voice whispered one last warning. But he had gone too far. The storm was here. The mountain was waiting. And now, suspended between the abyss and the lift, Derek Novick had to confront the full weight of what it meant to push too far, to chase one last thrill when the world had already said enough. The cold hit him first, sharp and immediate, as Derek Novick dangled over the abyss. 4:50. In 45 minutes, the sun would be gone, swallowed by the mountain and winter together. Not a fading glow, but pure, disorienting darkness, the kind that erased depth and distance. Below him, 50 feet of slope stretched into uncertainty, jagged and unforgiving even in daylight. The chair jerked violently. The cable overhead twanged like a metal string snapping too tight, sending a vibration through his entire body. He unlatched the safety bar, letting it swing up, only for the wind to slam it back with a sickening clang. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement a challenge to gravity itself. Carefully, he swung his legs forward, the skis strapped to his boots hanging heavy, a cruel tether he couldn't risk. With grim acceptance, he worked the first ski free. It plummeted, spinning into the white void below. 2 seasons old, K2 custom, $1,200. A ridiculous thought, almost laughable in the chaos. The second ski followed, and suddenly his body felt exposed, unmoored, lighter yet impossibly more vulnerable. He felt for the chair's metal frame beneath him, hands gripping the cold bar as the wind pushed like a living thing, trying to peel him from the mountain. For a suspended moment, he hung there, suspended between sky and slope, then let go. The fall hit harder than he expected. The air ripped from his lungs. his body colliding with snow, ice, and hidden rocks. He tumbled, rolled, branches tearing at his jacket, scraping skin, until a pine bough yanked his legs out from under him. He slammed into a deep drift that swallowed him, compressing him in a frozen embrace. For a heartbeat, or maybe a minute, the world went silent. Only his ragged breaths and the whisper of falling snow existed. The mountain, for a fleeting moment, held its breath with him. Pain radiated from his hip and cheek, hot and sharp, but nothing snapped, nothing deadly, alive. He flexed fingers and toes, tasted snow and blood, and pushed himself upright, snow clinging to his soaked jacket, wind burning his face. All around, the world had transformed into a ghostly landscape of white and shadow. The storm was coming, relentless and untamed. But for now, Derek Novick was still here, shaking, battered, aware of every nerve and muscle and every choice that had led him to this moment. He looked around, scanning the slope, the trees, the abyss beyond, knowing the night wasn't done with him yet. The mountain had disappeared. Above him, the slope vanished into a wall of snow so thick it swallowed the lift, the trees, even the sky. The wind had turned into a living thing, a low, growling roar weaving through the pines like the breath of some enormous beast. The cold wasn't just on his skin, it was inside him, gnawing at his lungs and chest with every ragged breath. Without skis, every step was a struggle through thigh-deep powder, each movement sucking energy from him in relentless waves. His boots weren't made for walking. His thighs screamed with every lift, and his lungs burned as if the snow itself were choking him. Visibility was a cruel joke. He could see barely 20 feet ahead, the wind shifting constantly, twisting the world into a maze of white and shadow. Shelter was urgent. Behind him, somewhere up that impossible slope, the resort waited. Below, the valley yawned, miles of unknown, hidden beneath drifts and darkness. He pushed downward, the only direction that felt like life. Up meant certain death. Standing still would freeze him where he was. Down at least held the whisper of roads, of rescue, of civilization buried somewhere in the storm. The forest closed in, branches clawing at his jacket, pine needles whipping his face. The wind here was slightly tamer, but the cold had a deeper bite, pressing into his chest with every inhalation. Glancing at his watch, 4:30. 15 minutes of moving felt like hours. His body was turning against him. Shivering had morphed into constant tremors. Thoughts tangled, disappearing mid-sentence, forcing him to backtrack and try to reclaim them. This was stage 1 hypothermia, creeping confusion that could destroy judgment, that could kill. His hand went to his jacket, instinctively reaching for his phone. But then reality hit. The pack was gone, left dangling on the lift chair above him, along with water, energy bars, a whistle, everything that might have saved him. Survival instincts screamed in protest, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to cling to. All that might have helped was now lost to the storm, swallowed by the mountain, leaving him exposed, alone, and facing the merciless white void. The first laugh escaped him, raw and ragged, more a gasp of disbelief than humor. 3 seasons teaching survival at the resort had never prepared him for this. He could see himself clearly in the lodge, lecturing to wide-eyed beginners, pointing to slides of hypothermia victims, drilling them on decision-making, on the 10 essentials, on the unforgiving rules of the backcountry. There was always that one slide. The man found dead less than a quarter mile from the highway, circling helplessly, lost in the white grip of freezing fog. Derek had used it every year to hammer home the point. Stay put, conserve strength. Don't make things worse. And now here he was, a living example of everything he had ever warned against. Alone in a storm that swallowed sight and sense, staggering blindly through thigh-deep powder, judgment slipping like water through his fingers. He tripped over a log hidden beneath the snow and hit the ground hard, hands scraping the icy crust. His gloves came away streaked with blood where a branch had ripped his cheek, the sting pulsing with each heartbeat. Not fatal, probably, but another weight added to the mountain of problems pressing down on him. He forced himself upright, one foot, then the other. Don't think about the cold. Don't think about how far he might have wandered. Don't think about the storm tightening around him like a predator or the creeping shiver that whispered of hypothermia's early grip. Just move, just survive. The forest stretched endlessly, a frozen labyrinth of white and shadow. How long had he been walking? 20 minutes, 40. Time had become meaningless. The trees emerged from the fog only to vanish behind him, dark sentinels in a world of blinding white. He tried to push in a straight line down the slope, but nature refused him. Fallen logs, dense thickets, sudden drops, each step required calculation, effort, muscle, and will. His legs felt like lead. Every motion demanded focus. Lift, push, plant, shift, repeat. His mind had narrowed to that single mechanical rhythm, the simplicity of survival reducing thought to a single, desperate directive. Keep moving. Each step forward was a small rebellion against the storm, against the cold, against the fear whispering that this might be the last run he would ever take. And somewhere beneath the roaring wind, a small, stubborn spark of him refused to let the mountain claim him. Derek froze, breath visible in ragged clouds, staring at the shape emerging from the storm. At first it seemed impossible, a dark silhouette slicing through the whiteout, slowly solidifying into a cabin. Weathered logs, a peaked roof heavy with snow, walls etched with frost and age. No smoke curled from a chimney, no welcoming light glowed from within. Yet it was real. A structure meant shelter. For a fleeting second, he questioned his own mind. Cold delirium, hallucinations, he'd read about them. Hypothermic wanderers saw rescuers that weren't there, roads that vanished, buildings that dissolved into trees or rocks. But this cabin was stubbornly tangible. Shadows pooled beneath its eaves. He could see the broken window, jagged shards like teeth. The door sagged crookedly, and icicles hung from the roofline in uneven clusters, details a hallucination couldn't maintain. Legs trembling, he forced himself forward, slogging through drifts toward the clearing. The cabin sat surrounded by pines that leaned protectively, their snow-laden branches brushing the ground. As he approached, unease prickled his spine. One window was shattered, leaving a jagged void. The door's misalignment whispered neglect or something deliberate. Nothing overtly threatening, yet something about it felt wrong, subtly dissonant, like a word misspelled on a page. The snow atop the roof slanted unnaturally, the clearing too circular, as if the forest itself had been reshaped around it. He lingered at the edge of the clearing, instinct screaming caution. Instructor voices from memory shouted at him. Evaluate, observe, trust your gut. But there was no alternative. Freeze here and he would die. When faced with subtle wrongness or certain death, he knew which choice survival demanded. Each step toward the cabin felt like trudging through cement. His body was moving, but thought had grown sluggish, dulled by cold and exhaustion. At last he reached the door, hands shaking as he tested the handle. It yielded with a groan, swinging inward to reveal darkness that swallowed the frame. The storm's howl seemed to pause, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Derek stepped inside, every nerve alight, heart hammering with the certainty that once he crossed this threshold, nothing about the world outside would matter. Derek stumbled into the cabin, and for the first time in hours, the wind and storm outside felt distant. Though the warmth inside was faint, it was something, a fragile relief. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, each breath fogging in the icy air that had seeped inside. The space was tiny, no more than 15 feet square, a single room that carried the scent of old pine and dust. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened with years of cold ash. Against another wall sat a rough-hewn table, two chairs pushed awkwardly to the side, and a narrow cot with a thin, bare mattress. Shelves lined the far wall, empty, save for a scattering of dust and pine needles drifting in from the broken window. Small piles of animal droppings marked one corner, mice, perhaps squirrels, but their presence only made the cabin feel alive, real. Derek's teeth chattered, shivers racking him from head to toe. He knew the warning signs all too well. Shivering was stage one, the body's desperate fight to keep warm. If that stopped, it meant his core temperature was slipping, life shutting down piece by piece. Stage 3 was unconsciousness, death. He needed heat. Now. The fireplace offered hope, filled with cold ash but flanked by a stack of pine, split, dry, grayed with age. On the mantel sat a box of matches, swollen and soft from damp, yet the rattle of them inside was music to his ears. Dropping to his knees, he cleared the hearth with gloved hands, fingers stiff and clumsy, each motion deliberate. He gathered pine needles for tinder, arranged smaller twigs into a careful pyramid. When the first match sparked, it burst to life in bright orange brilliance. He cupped it gently, lowering it to the tinder. Instantly, the needles ignited, flames licking upward, hungry for the kindling. Within moments, fire roared to life, painting the cabin in flickering warmth. The heat hit his face, and for an instant he could almost cry from relief. He fed larger logs to the fire, felt the dizzying contrast of warmth against the cold that still clung to his skin. Steam rose from his wet clothes. He needed to shed layers, but the thought of stripping in this frozen room made him hesitate. For now, he could at least remove his jacket, draping it near the flames. Slowly, methodically, he worked, letting the fire grow, letting the warmth seep into his bones, a fragile shield against the mountain storm still raging beyond the walls. Each crackle of pine, each flicker of flame became a lifeline, a fragile heartbeat of survival in the whiteout that had threatened to swallow him whole. Nails protruded from the wall beside the fireplace, rusted and fragile, but still strong enough to hold weight. Derek hung his jacket over them, letting it soak up the faint heat radiating from the fire. He followed with his gloves, feeling some small comfort in these simple, practical acts. The cabin was slowly losing its icy grip. He tugged the cot closer to the hearth and sank onto the edge, the mattress sighing beneath him, and releasing a puff of dust mixed with a musty, vaguely unpleasant smell, like blankets left too long in a damp corner. Still, he was warm. The fire burned. The endless shivering that had racked his body for hours began to ease. His eyes roamed the cabin more thoroughly now. The table was roughly made but solid, the chairs matching in their rugged simplicity. Someone had intended to stay here to make this space livable, at least temporarily. The shelves were bare, coated in dust, yet the marks of past occupancy were clear. Tools, food, supplies, they had been here once. But why? The cabin was miles from any road, reachable only by trail in summer and cut off entirely in winter. It could have been a hunting shelter, a Forest Service outpost, but it felt different, permanent, deliberate. Someone had chosen to live here intentionally and not for just a weekend. Derek's gaze drifted to the door at the back wall. It was darker than the surrounding wood, weathered in a way that suggested smoke or moisture had seeped into it. There was no handle, only a simple hook and eye latch mounted on the outside, facing inward, as if whatever was behind it was meant to stay contained. A lock that kept things in rather than out. The thought gripped him and refused to leave. What kind of thing would need to be confined like that? What would warrant a door designed to hold it captive? Shivering slightly, he rose unsteady, feeling the lingering effects of cold settling deep in his bones. His hand reached for the latch, but a sudden gust rattled the cabin walls, and the broken window sang with a high, whistling note, like a voice from far away. Beneath that eerie sound, Derek thought he heard something else. A whisper, a name, or just the storm mocking him, playing tricks on his mind. He froze, heart hammering, and instinctively stepped back from the door, feeling the weight of a presence he couldn't yet define. Something was behind it, something that hadn't been meant for him to find. And for the first time, the fire's warmth felt fragile, almost insufficient against the certainty that he was not alone. The fire crackled, tiny sparks dancing into the cold air, and Derek sank back onto the cot, forcing himself to focus. Nothing else mattered except warmth, staying awake and surviving long enough for help to arrive. Outside, the storm howled, relentless, but inside this small refuge, there was a fragile shield of heat. He bent over, fumbling with his ski boots, so stiff, unyielding. His fingers slipped on the icy laces, the leather biting at his skin as if refusing to let go. But step by step, struggle by struggle, they came off, piled near the fire, steaming in the heat. The wet socks followed, dragging cold misery from his feet. Pale, almost ghostly, his toes twitched, a warning whispered by numbness and pins and needles pain. He rubbed them with desperate hands, coaxing warmth back into flesh that seemed to have forgotten how to live. Waxiness tinged the tips of his left toes, early frostbite. He knew he had to keep them raised, keep them alive, pray that circulation returned before it was too late. Slowly, the warmth spread. The fire's soft glow pushed back the cold, his shivers dimmed to occasional tremors and the dizzy haze lifting from his mind. For the first time since the lift had halted, survival seemed possible. The storm would end. Help would come. They would find his abandoned pack, raise the alarm, send out a team. He only had to endure a few more hours, stay conscious, keep the fire between him and death. And then a sound. The door behind him creaked open. Derek's heart slammed into his chest, his head whipping around. A woman stood there, framed by the storm's gray-white fury. Perhaps 40, dressed in hiking gear that looked stylish but woefully unprepared. Thin jacket, gloves soaked through, no hat. Snow clung to her dark hair, her skin pale not just from cold but something else, something unreadable. She froze, her eyes locking onto his with a stare that could have been shock or something far darker. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Derek's mind raced. Another survivor, someone lost like him, seeking shelter, hope for a shared battle against the storm. Relief surged. He wasn't alone anymore. Two could endure the night better than one. But as she stepped inside, the door shutting behind her with deliberate care, that relief evaporated. Every instinct screamed at him. There was something about her, something in the tilt of her head, the cold precision of her movements that didn't belong to this storm, to this cabin, to simple survival. And in that instant, Derek realized that what had just become his salvation might also be the beginning of a far greater danger. The way she moved wasn't natural. Every step, every gesture was measured, deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though each motion had been plotted and executed with precision. Her movements were economical, fluid, unnervingly calm. She glanced at the fire, then back at Derek, and a flicker passed over her face, something he couldn't read. Not shock, not fear. Something quieter, sharper, recognition, satisfaction. Without a word, she drifted toward the fireplace, lifting her hands toward the flames. Derek's eyes tracked her every move. Her gloves, dark with soaking wetness, should have steamed instantly, but nothing. Not a wisp of vapor. The snow clinging to her hair, frozen tight against her skull, remained crystalline, unyielding, untouched by the heat around her. Physics itself seemed to bend around her presence. He waited, breath held, for the inevitable drip, the melt, but it never came. Something about her presence felt wrong. Too controlled, too confident, too unmoved by the storm. Derek cleared his throat and the sound cut through the cabin like a gunshot. She pivoted smoothly to face him, and when she smiled, it was a slow, unsettling curve. Less a human smile, more like an animal showing teeth. Not threatening, not hostile, but sharp, deliberate, unnerving. "Vera," she said, as if answering a question Derek hadn't even asked. "Derek," he rasped, his voice cracking, throat raw from the cold. Her eyes swept over the cabin, taking in the broken window, the bare shelves, the back door. Her gaze lingered there longer than a glance, as though she were staring at an old, familiar face. Something passed over her features, recognition, hunger, satisfaction, he couldn't tell which. Then she moved toward a chair and lowered herself with the same precise control. Her soaked clothes clung to her body, jacket darkened by water, pants pressed tight, but she didn't shiver, didn't inch closer to the fire. She simply sat, statuesque, hands resting on the armrests, utterly still. Derek added another log to the fire, watching the flames lick upward. A strange weight settled over him, both heavy and light, as if the warmth pressed down like a tangible force. The cabin was cold, his breath fogging the air, but the fire's heat had become almost suffocating, crawling over his skin like an invisible hand. And all the while Vera sat, perfectly still, her frozen hair shimmering in the firelight, an impossible presence that made the ordinary rules of the world feel irrelevant. Derek shivered, feeling the cold draft slicing through the broken window. The fire flickered, but it wasn't enough to make the cabin feel stifling. No, the weight pressing down on him wasn't the warmth. It was something else, something heavier, unspoken. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the walls, and the snow fell so thick it seemed solid, like a frozen wall trying to trap them inside. Vera's voice broke the silence, soft and reflective, as if they had been speaking for hours. She spoke of teaching second graders, of 8- and 9-year-olds who believed everything she said without question. Her tone was almost dreamlike, like she was narrating someone else's memories, a life detached and distant. Derek's eyes flicked to her hands, pale and still, resting perfectly on the chair's arms. No twitching, no fidgeting, not even the tiny unconscious movements that made people human. She sat as if carved from ice or stone, untouched by the storm, untouched by fear. She asked him about the mountain, her questions deliberate, measured like a probe testing his mind, weighing him in silence. Derek spoke, explaining why he had stayed for one last run, defending his choice to a stranger whose very presence seemed to bend reality. Why did he feel the need to justify himself? A woman whose snow didn't melt, whose stillness felt impossible, listened intently, that eerie, too wide smile never leaving her face. "The mountain doesn't care about experience," she said softly. "It takes whoever it wants." The words tightened his throat. Takes, not catches, not claims, takes. As if the mountain reached out with intention, as if it had a mind of its own. Derek realized his shivering had vanished entirely, leaving a strange, hollow sensation. Relief should have followed, but it didn't. His body felt disconnected, as though he were watching himself from across the room. The fire's glow burned bright, almost painfully, and in that light, Vera's face seemed less human than before. Shadows fell unevenly, some too deep, some too flat, twisting her features into something uncanny. Her eyes caught the flames, but the reflection was wrong, too steady, too sharp, like an animal frozen in headlights. Without warning, she rose, movements fluid and unnerving like water flowing over rock. Her presence made Derek's stomach churn. She glided toward the broken window, pressing close to the icy glass, staring out at the blizzard with an intensity that made the storm outside feel small, insignificant. The snow thrashed, The wind screamed, and yet she seemed utterly untouched, as if she belonged to a world beyond the one he knew, and as if she had come for him. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind tearing at the cabin walls. Then Vera spoke, her voice soft, almost hypnotic, tinged with a strange, greenish calm. She told him a story, one that seemed almost like a confession, almost like a warning. 23 years ago, she began, another hiker had come to this very cabin, trapped in a storm identical to this one. The woman had lit a fire, thought herself safe. The blizzard raged for 3 relentless days. Supplies ran out. The warmth vanished. The cold returned, creeping in, relentless, unforgiving. Derek's throat went dry. He wanted to interrupt, to ask why she was telling him this, but the words wouldn't come. And deep down, he knew interrupting would be wrong. He needed to hear it. Vera's eyes never left the snow outside. She spoke of hunger, but not the kind that gnaws at the belly. This hunger was alive. It seeped into thought, twisting perception, reshaping morality, bending what was possible. It had a voice, she said, a voice that never stopped whispering once you had heard it. She spoke with intimate familiarity, as though she had lived it herself. Derek could almost feel it in her words, the way the hunger consumed the body, intertwined with the cold, becoming indistinguishable from it. It made the impossible feel achievable, the unthinkable seem inevitable. Then she turned, and the firelight revealed her face in full. Skin stretched too tightly over her bones, eyes bright and reflective in a way that shouldn't exist. Something in her expression, something no longer human if it ever had been. She told him about the back room, about the 3 bodies left behind by previous hikers, those who had reached the cabin but could go no further, preserved by the cold, frozen solid, sitting as if waiting. The woman she spoke of had stared at them, and the hunger had surged, drowning conscience, morality, humanity itself. She survived those 3 days, but not untouched. The cabin's air seemed to thicken. The fire still burned, warm against his face, yet beneath that warmth, a deeper cold gnawed at him, as if it had risen from inside his own chest, seeping out, rooting itself in his bones. Vera shifted closer, silent, deliberate. Derek tried to move, to stand, to retreat, but his legs wouldn't respond. His arms felt like lead. Panic flickered, but his body had stopped obeying him. He was trapped, paralyzed, and the story, the warning, the hunger, the storm, had become a living presence in the room with him. She spoke softly, her words sliding through the cabin like smoke. She told him about the arrest, the darkness of a cell, the moment she should have died, and how something had pulled her back to this very place. How a hunger, relentless and eternal, had followed her even into death, tying her to the storm and the cabin year after year. "I am her," she whispered, voice trembling yet certain. "I'm Vera Holloway." The name struck Derek like ice. Every local, every skier who dared the mountain knew it. Vera Holloway, the teacher who had survived 3 days trapped in a snowbound cabin by consuming what should have been unthinkable. The legend told to frighten visitors, to warn them of the mountain's unforgiving nature. A tale of caution, of fire left in the wrong place, of the unprepared who vanished into white silence. But hadn't she died decades ago in a county jail cell? 23 years ago, hadn't she? Derek tried to move, to pull away, but his body betrayed him. The cold had burrowed too deep, freezing muscles, slowing his heartbeat to a crawl. Consciousness began to fray, drifting like smoke on the wind. And yet part of him wondered if it was the cold at all, or something far older, far darker, pressing into him from the cabin itself. Vera leaned closer, fingers brushing his torn cheek, ice against skin. She spoke of fire, how it called to the hungry, how it showed them the way home. Her words were deliberate, dripping slow and inexorable, like water leaking through stone. like truths long denied yet impossible to ignore. Derek's gaze flicked to the back wall. The door was moving. Slowly, impossibly, the latch creaked open. The door swung inward and a stench drifted out. Charred meat, coal, and something indescribable. Something that should have remained buried, forgotten. Vera's hand smoothed his hair with a tenderness that made his stomach twist. She spoke again, telling him of the others, those who had come before, frozen in time, trapped by storms, thinking they were safe, only to be consumed by the mountain and left behind. 3 from decades past, 2 more from later storms, countless souls over the years, their fires snuffed, their bodies preserved in silence. Then Derek felt them, cold hands too many tugging at his clothes, probing, insistent. He struggled, but his limbs would not obey. The cold had claimed him, or perhaps it wasn't the cold at all. Something older, waiting long before Vera ever stumbled through the snow. Something patient and eternal had reached for him. He realized he was being moved, dragged, pulled toward the shadows at the back of the cabin, toward the door swinging wide, into the place where the hunger waited. And in that moment the fire's warmth became meaningless, the storm outside irrelevant. Only the cabin, the darkness beyond the door, and the unbroken, hungry gaze of Vera Holloway remained. And Derek knew that whatever had been waiting for decades had finally found him. He was dragged across the cabin floor, pulled toward that yawning darkness beyond the door. The last thing his eyes caught before the black swallowed him was Vera's face, smiling down, an expression impossible to read. Was it pity, anticipation, or something beyond humanity, raw and hungry, ancient and patient? Morning came with a silence so bright it hurt to look at. The storm had spent itself overnight, leaving the mountains cloaked in blinding white. The rescue team arrived at first light. They found the abandoned lift chair, tracks carved into the snow leading through the woods, vanishing after 100 yards, but the path clear enough, pointing toward the old service trails. The cabin sat in its clearing as it had for half a century. Snow drifted around it, doors shut tight, no smoke from the chimney. But the footprints leading to it were unmistakable, fresh despite the wind that had scoured the clearing. Someone had made it this far. The rescuers knocked, wary but trained. Winter cabins were traps for the unprepared. The wood groaned as the door swung open, swollen and warped with age. Inside, Derek Novick lay curled on his side on the cot, facing the fireplace. The cold had preserved him. Bate, the team leader, had seen this scene too many times to be startled, but instinct made her pause. Hypothermia, frozen wound on his cheek, hands tucked to conserve heat, ski boots neatly near the fire, jacket hanging on rusted nails. Every detail screamed survival effort. And yet there were other details. The jacket had been opened, shirt pulled up, skin exposed. Marks crisscrossed his torso. Not animal scratches, not anything natural, precise, intentional, wrong, as if made by hands that functioned differently than human hands, yet deliberate in every motion. Bate studied him, nodding the subtle terror in the stillness. She had seen countless victims of the cold, drifting into a quiet, peaceful oblivion. Death by freezing often looked like sleep, relief, even serenity. But Derek Novick had not died that way. His mouth hung open, frozen mid-word, as if he had tried to speak, to warn, to scream, and never finished. Perhaps in mid-scream, his eyes were frozen wide, glassy with terror, the kind of fear that clawed at the soul itself. The younger EMT stepped back, swallowing bile, unable to meet them. Bate had seen this expression before, but only in victims of violent ends, people who'd glimpsed something so monstrous in their final moments that it shattered the core of them. The fireplace was cold. Bates' eyes swept over it, trained to catch every anomaly. Ash lay undisturbed, decades old. No warmth had touched it. The wood stacked beside it was gray, damp with rot, crumbling with age. One of the team spoke first. Derek hadn't lit a fire. Nothing had burned here for years, perhaps decades. And yet there he was, frozen in front of the hearth, positioned as if basking in heat that didn't exist. Every muscle, every posture aimed to drink warmth from flames that weren't there. They noticed more. Dust on the floor had been scuffed, prints scattered around the fireplace, but they led nowhere. Started near the hearth and simply vanished as if whoever made them had ceased to exist mid-step. 4 distinct patterns, maybe more, all converging where Derek's body lay. Faint drag marks trailed from the cot toward the back of the cabin. The rear door stood open, unsettling in its stillness. Bate approached it cautiously, though instinct told her it wasn't the snow or cold that made her pause. The latch was mounted unusually, on the outside facing the main room, as though it was designed to keep something inside rather than out. The detail lodged in her mind like a splinter. She had seen hundreds of old cabins over 15 years in search and rescue, but never one with a latch mounted like this, not on an interior door, not unless someone, or something, was meant to be contained. The room beyond was tiny, more closet than chamber, empty except for layers of dust. In the far corner, dark stains marred the wood, ancient, sinister, impossible to ignore. Bate photographed them but didn't touch. Some truths were better left untouched. Sometimes the answers only deepened the horror. Her eyes drifted back to the fireplace. Derek's jacket hung from nails, the rusted metal barely able to hold its weight. Yet there it was, draped carefully, a silent testament to order amid chaos, a hint of intention behind every frozen detail of the cabin. They almost missed it, until Bate noticed how perfectly the jacket hung, as if careful hands had placed it there, smoothing it down, making sure it didn't slip. Not tossed, not abandoned, arranged. Inside the pocket, they found the ordinary pieces of a life. A wallet, an ID, a photograph worn soft at the edges. Derek stood beside a woman, younger, happier, both of them smiling into the sun on another mountain long ago. Behind them, the peak rose calm and massive, like something watching over them. A different place, a different time. Then Bates saw the ring. It sat snug on Derek Novik's finger, tight with cold as though it had never been removed. That detail bothered her more than all the rest. Later, his ex-wife would tell them Derek had stopped wearing it the day their divorce became final, 3 years earlier. He'd taken it off, put it away, refused to sell it, refused even to look at it again. Said it was somewhere in storage, lost, forgotten. But here it was. Not loose, not recently slipped on, it looked settled, as if it belonged there, as if it had been waiting. The official conclusion came quickly. Hypothermia, worsened by injuries from the fall. The strange marks on his torso were written off as animal interference after death, though no one could quite agree on what kind of animal could leave impressions like that. The position of his body suggested confusion, him crawling toward the fireplace, chasing warmth that wasn't real. Hallucinations were common in freezing deaths, the report said. The mind's final mercy, creating comfort where none existed. A tragic accident, a warning about winter mountains. The cabin was flagged for demolition. Signs were posted down the trail, though no one really went there anymore, especially not in winter. Paperwork moved slowly. Budgets tight. Priorities shifted. The cabin remained, sinking deeper into the landscape each year, wood softening, roof sagging, becoming part of the mountain again. Case closed. Except it was. There were things no one put in the report. things that didn't fit neatly into checkboxes or cause of death summaries. The way the air inside the cabin felt wrong, not just cold, but heavy, oppressive, like stepping into a room where something terrible had just happened and hadn't finished happening yet. The way Bate kept sensing someone close behind her, close enough to feel, close enough to almost hear breathing, only to turn and find empty space every time. She told herself it was exhaustion, shock, too many recoveries over too many years. But even as they left, even as the door closed and the snow swallowed their tracks, Bate couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't empty, that it never truly had been, that something there had been watching them quietly, patiently, waiting for the next fire to be lit. But when they turned, there was only empty space. Shadows clung to corners, too dark for the pale morning light spilling in. One of the team later swore he heard whispers during the recovery, soft, overlapping voices, repeating the same words over and over, just at the edge of hearing. He refused to say what they were. A month later, he requested a transfer, saying he couldn't face mountain rescues again. As Derek's body was lifted into the basket, Bate glanced back at the cabin. For a heartbeat, she saw her. A woman in the broken window, dark hair plastered to her pale face, eyes catching the sun in a way that made them impossible. She didn't move, didn't react, just watched. And then blink and the window was empty. Broken glass, darkness beyond, just light playing tricks, just exhaustion, just the mountain mocking the tired mind. They told themselves that all the way down. The cabin still stands. Every few years, someone stumbles across it, usually by accident. The lift breaks down in storms. Hikers get trapped when the weather turns faster than expected. And sometimes in the dead of winter, in the heart of the worst storms, there are reports. Smoke curling from empty clearings, voices whispering names on the wind, glimpses of a woman moving uphill while everyone else flees downhill, her smile too wide, her eyes too bright. No one investigates. Warnings are clear, trails closed, cabin marked dangerous. Some places are meant to be left alone. Some doors are meant to stay shut. Some fires are better never lit. Because fire is warmth, warmth is life, and life is what the dead hunger for most of all. The cabin waits, stone patient, cold as winter, hungry as the dark, waiting for the next storm, the next lost soul, the next desperate person grateful for shelter, for heat, for the illusion of safety in a world designed to claim them. The mountain takes who it wants, and what the mountain takes, it keeps forever.